I will never forget the first time I genuinely felt myself represented on stage as a Latino. I was 18 and I had only been a fan of theater for almost 2 years. For the second time in my life, I was seeing a show on Broadway. It was summer 2016, the summer of Hamilton. Now, of course, I didn't have the money to see Hamilton. I still don't. But that was okay because I wasn't there to see Hamilton. That's not what I wanted to see. I was there to see another new show from that season, a show I was obsessed with. I was there to see On Your Feet, the jukebox musical about Gloria and Emilio Estefan. I had just the best seats in the orchestra. I had watched every talk show performance. I memorized the cast. I thought I was ready. This was my show. And then it started. The curtain swiped away and revealed the most incredible band. And for the next couple of hours, I was in awe of all of the talent I was seeing on stage. And even more, they all looked like me. Being so early into my love of theater, naturally, it took a while before I was able to access a show like In the Heights. So even though it's my favorite show now, I hadn't quite reached that point yet. So to me, On Your Feet was a bright, encouraging light that told me that people like myself did have the capacity to do great things on stage, and that I too could have a place in the theater if I wanted it. And that's a feeling I've never truly forgotten. Fast forward 10 years and the Latinos were back. Something special was happening on stage. Broadway not only had another show centered around Latine stories, it had two. Enter Buena Vista Social Club, the jukebox musical based on the 1997 smash hit album, and Real Women Have Curves, based on the play by Josefina López and its 2002 film adaptation. In one of the biggest seasons in Broadway history, these two shows became indelibly linked to one another, not only because they were Latine shows that opened in the same season, but because they redefined the path for Latine theater artists in a way that has not been seen since In the Heights, and showed the excitement and beauty that is possible when we embrace as many voices as possible in the theater. While these shows' time on Broadway together was short-lived, it was more than enough to show what can be done. In this episode, we're going to look at these two shows. We're going to learn about their stories, what makes them so special as pieces of art, and how they individually fit into the Broadway community. Through this, we'll be able to track how far the depiction of Latine stories and characters has evolved and see why these shows represented such a momentous moment in the history of Broadway. We're going to explore how shows such as these can become catalysts for creating a theater landscape that has space for every artist and opens them up to the chance to pass down the experience that I had at On Your Feet all of those years ago. I'm Ricky, and this is Pocket Dramaturg, Episode 6, Por la Cultura, Buena Vista Social Club, and Real Women Have Curves on Broadway.
First time I felt represented on stage, I remember it very vividly. I was in high school, I was around 16 or 17, and my mom and I went to go see Chicago at Playhouse Square. And I remember sitting down and opening the playbill and seeing that Bianca Marroquin was playing Roxy Hart. And I remember leaving that production once it was done, being like, at that point I had been doing theater for a few years, but I remember thinking, oh, the journey is just beginning. Like, we can do anything. We don't only have to tell our own stories and be roles that reflect our identity. We can do the classics. We can do that show. We can be that role, because I just got to see a Latina Roxy Hart. So we can actually do anything we want in this career. We can do that too, you know? And that was a really powerful moment. I mean, I still remember it to this day.
So before I start diving into Buena Vista Social Club and Real Women Have Curves, I got to situate us for what the landscape for Latine artists in Broadway musicals has looked like. As is the case for other artists of the global majority in all forms of media in the US, we've been struggling. So to start, like with all things, it's not like Latine performers magically came out of the woodwork when West Side Story opened on Broadway. In the study of representation, there's this core tenet that the way we use a quote-unquote thing inherently tells the world something about what is important to us as a society. That's one of the things that makes up our culture. So when the US decides to break a mold and choose to make stars out of someone like Cuban entertainer Desi Arnaz and Brazilian performer Carmen Miranda, we can learn about what the US valued at that time. Side note, for a book that goes into really awesome and specific detail about this kind of concept, I recommend Christina Klein's Cold War Orientalism. It's all about the US's attitudes towards Asia during the Cold War through how Asian characters and stories were presented at the time. So on the one hand, you have people like Arnaz and Miranda there to foster diplomacy with Latin America. Let's not forget that the US was in the business of having business in Latin America, whether it was in the name of gaining favorable terms for trade or some other political need, like keeping out communism. Like the term banana republic comes about because of the US's ability to use its business influence to get countries to even act against their own best interest to help the US. So there has to be some kind of trade-off for that. So in addition to money, the US, wanting to look better, would provide a limited amount of visibility in the media to these countries. That's how Donald Duck gets his friends Panchito and Jose, and Hollywood and Broadway get Desi Arnaz and Carmen Miranda. And when you find yourself in a position like these two, you don't get to dictate the rules of engagement. So for their time, they broke ground in actually giving some light to Latin America as a place with people who could actually, be intelligent and talented. That lack of autonomy in their portrayal is what led to the normalization of stereotypes. Like, to be clear, this was a time where all of Latin America was treated as that quote unquote south of the border mentality, a nondescript place where you can get away with anything. These weren't countries with individual cultures and histories and people. Only places with big standing political or economic ties to the US were given privileges of being quote unquote on the map and having some of their culture be visible. These were countries like, Cuba, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. So when the US, who genuinely doesn't know anything about the rest of Latin America, starts to bring in artists from these countries, they conflate them into a pan-Latin identity and assume that whatever stereotype I assume you're thinking of right now is the truth. And then as more and more immigrants from Latin America get folded in, those existing stereotypes start to form with new ones that are based on fear and xenophobia. In short, that's how we get from the tropical fruit-wearing, exotic Carmen Miranda to the sharks in West Side Story. And from there, even when shows began to add themes relating to Latine stories, it became a battle over whether those stories would be respectful or whether Latine performers were actually going to be playing those roles. And this is not to say the stereotypes ever stopped becoming added, but this is a new layer that we have to fold into this conversation. So for example, West Side Story is a groundbreaking achievement in moving forward what the musical could be. Somewhere in that conversation has to be the point that it's a show where xenophobia, racism, assault, and other things are the qualities of the protagonist, and does not do enough legwork to give the Latinos their due, to be on an even playing field with them. It attempts to understand or make claims about the experiences of being Latine without the input of those artists themselves. And up until recently, and sometimes still, it's a 50-50 shot if Latinos are actually going to get to play those roles. So by the mid-90s, this was unfortunately the norm. You have West Side setting the template. You have one role in Bye Bye Birdie, which is leaning into that Pan-Latin stereotype. Evita, which is a show written by two British men, set in Argentina, about Argentinians, with nary a Latino in sight. So then you get a show like 1998's The Cape Man, a show which I will 1000% be doing an episode on one day. It is my obsession and I will not let it go. Which, while steering into every single one of the problems I've already mentioned, indirectly finally opens up the discussion of representation on a large scale to where artists of the day finally address that stories by Latine artists for Latine artists do not exist in the way that they should. And it's about damn time that we start taking ownership over our image on stage. And you know what the funny thing is? Somehow, in some indirect way, Buena Vista Social Club and Real Women Have Curves were at least the smallest percent to thank for this shift in attitude. Because the source material for these shows came from that area I mentioned where Latinos began to take more ownership of their representation and presence in the media. Like, while it wasn't intentional, it's very unsurprising that these shows have found themselves linked on Broadway because their original properties seem to have always been at least in the same solar system. So let's look at these original source materials and how they kind of fit into this area. So first is Josefina López's original play, Real Women Have Curves. By the time the play premiered in 1990, the Latine population in the US was in the midst of the biggest boom it had ever seen. It went from 6.4% of the US population at the start of the 80s to 9% at the start of the 90s, which in terms of actual people, that's a huge number, especially coming from where it had been in decades before. This was mostly due to immigration, especially from Central and South America. So you can see the beginnings of the need to break down that idea that all Latine people are the same, because the US was finally starting to have to engage with people who don't all act the same. And of course, with this surge comes all the fears and political pushback that comes with it. One piece of policy being the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which threatened employers with fines for hiring undocumented workers and essentially gave a whole lot more power to border control. The 80s became that era where the pressure to crack down on immigration, especially from Latin America, became a thing. So by the start of the 90s, you have Josefina López, who was one of these immigrants, having lived in the US since she was 5 and recently receiving amnesty in 1987, writing a play where everything I just mentioned is front and center. Josefina wrote a play that broke ground as a piece of representation from its respective community that didn't try to portray anything but the truth, because that's what had to be said. And as the 90s continued, the influence of Latine culture only grew and grew and grew. Latinos across the country occupied more political office, and the world was introduced to artists like Marc Anthony, Ricky Martin, Shakira, and Selena. Included in this explosion of Latine culture is the 1997 album, Buena Vista Social Club. The album was created after a collab with a group of Cuban and artists from Mali fell through. Producer Nick Gold and guitarist Ry Cooder, who had conceived the project and had already arrived in Cuba, decided to pivot and only use local Cuban artists and record an album of standards from the genres of son, danzón, bolero, guajira, and others coming from the 30s and all the way to the 80s. Before I continue, let me make something clear. One of the most common ways that the album is described is that it's an album of quote-unquote forgotten or lost songs. I will never, ever describe them as such. Just because it wasn't recorded sooner or blow up sooner in your country, it does not mean that it wasn't always a big deal. These songs were never lost or forgotten, you just never heard them before. At the risk of spiraling and ranting, we're going to move on. As I mentioned, the album was a massive hit. It was a hit worldwide, it reached the top of the Latin Billboard charts, and even made it into the top 100 in the US. Its first year, it sold 1 million copies in the US and 3 million copies abroad. It won the Grammy for Best Traditional Tropical Latin Album in 1998. Then came the documentary. In 1999, filmmaker Wim Wenders released a documentary taken throughout the process of recording the album. The film mostly centers around getting to know the musicians on the album, the virtuosos of their respective instruments, many of them in their 50s, 60s, and some even as old as their 80s. This is how so many people were introduced to artists such as Eliades Ochoa, Ruben Gonzalez, Ibrahim Ferrer, Omar Portuondo, and the musical director Juan de Marcos Gonzalez. These musicians had gotten their starts as far back as the 20s and 30s playing for bands across Cuba. The documentary acts to tell their stories, who they were, who they played for, how their lives had changed as Cuba had, and ultimately making the album. The album and documentary was the gateway for many of the members of the band to reach a level of fame that they hadn't known in their careers to that point. Like Ferrer and Ruben Gonzalez in their late 70s would get their own spin-off albums, whereas Ochoa and Portuondo, two of the few surviving members of the band, they're still performing in their late 70s and their mid-90s. Imagine letting musicians unabashedly age and treating that age as added wisdom and room for skill instead of explicitly only focusing on young artists. Art versus commerce, I guess. Side personal note, I currently work in the performing arts department of an art museum, and last year we had Eliades Ochoa perform in concert. And Eliades, who is like 77 years old now, he still got it. Like, he's in his late 70s, and it was hands down one of the most impressive performances I've ever seen in my life. So going into the early 2000s, you have Latine artists everywhere who, like Josefina López, can see what it's like to see your stories on stage. And you can see from the success of Buena Vista Social Club that when given access, La Cultura can be incredibly popular. All of that momentum was there. Josefina was even able to revisit Real Women Have Curves in 2002 when she wrote the HBO film adaptation that starred America Ferrera, which I watched in research for this, and it is very different from the play and the musical. So it's no surprise that the very next show to have such a focus on the culture was In the Heights from Lin-Manuel Miranda, who also grew from that place of recognizing the responsibility he had with his skills. But we finally did it. A show about Latinos where we were represented as people, not criminals, not a stereotype, just people. A show written by Latinos, starring Latinos, that was without a doubt a hit. It's not like everything changed overnight, but maybe slowly we were starting to get there. In 2009, a revival of West Side Story finally began to take the casting to heart and opened with even translated and interpreted lyrics, which on its own wasn't met without controversy. We got a revival of Evita, which at least had Latinos in the lead roles. And in 2016, we were finally even able to participate in a jukebox musical with On Your Feet, which, while maybe not setting the world on fire, was really something great at the time. So, I've made a timeline of shows that more or less center around Hispanic or Latine stories to demonstrate how slim the pickings were before 2025. 1957, West Side Story. 1966, Man of La Mancha, and trust me, this one's pushing it. 1979, Evita. 1993, Kiss of the Spider Woman. 1998, The Cape Man. 2008, In the Heights. 2016, On Your Feet. Now, there's probably some in there I've forgotten, but when I say that it's a big deal that in one season we had two of these shows at the same time, understand, with everything I've said before, this is a huge deal. We were due.
When I think of the importance of the global majority or Latin people seeing themselves represented on stage, I immediately think of the next generation. You know, when I have kids, I don't want them to just see themselves as just the accented comedic relief or, you know, the drug dealer, cartel leader, you know, like the criminal thing. Like, I want them to be able to see themselves as, for example, Miles Morales is the hero, you know, seeing themselves in the lead roles, being the good guy, being the doctor, the president, whatever it might be, you know, because those representations serve as inspiration for our younger generations and things like that. And I want them to be able to look at themselves in those roles and look at themselves in those spaces and realize that they can do whatever they want to do.
So now that I hopefully have imparted on you where the state of Latine stories on Broadway were before 2025, I think we can formally move into talking about these shows at the heart of this episode. The story of the musical Buena Vista Social Club begins when screenwriter Marco Ramirez was approached by the producers who were looking for a way to adapt the album into a show. Ramirez hadn't written a musical before, but he respected the producers' willingness to let him try and figure it out himself. Ramirez is a Miami native, which, in case you don't know, Miami has a huge Cuban population and influence. In multiple interviews, he has always been clear about how the album was a consistent presence in his life. As a kid, they were literally the songs that his grandfather listened to on bootleg cassettes, so getting to work on the show was like getting to hold on to a piece of him. He said he felt the same kind of conviction of Indiana Jones that it, meaning the songs, belong in a museum. He was a firm believer that the artistry of these musicians and of so many other Latin musicians should be considered in the same vein of the greatest composers in history like Mozart, Bach, and Rachmaninoff, which, if you've seen the show on stage, you know he makes abundantly clear. He didn't know really where to start, but what he did know was that the music had to be the star of the show. It's a hard task to write, especially when you don't know the roadmap. I mean, I wrote this episode like 3 times, so I can only imagine where he's coming from, even if he did know the themes of the music. What he needed was someone to help guide him, and someone to help him. And then he saw a performance of James I.Am's Fat Ham. After seeing the show, it became clear that the person he needed to help him harness the music and the show into something special was its director, Saheem Ali. For the Kenyan-born associate artistic director of the Public Theater, this somehow became the right show at the right time. He has talked about all of the creative pieces that needed to fall into place for him to be ready for a challenge like this. For one, as a teen, he too was one of the people who became obsessed with the album. He claimed to learn all of the lyrics without speaking a word of Spanish. He had recently taken a trip to Cuba, which had given him the confidence to tackle stories outside of his own cultural experience with sensitivity. And most importantly, as Ramirez started to delve into the themes of immigration and leaving home, it became personal for Ali, who could share in that experience while being able to feel the connective tissue between the music of Buena Vista and the African influences that are present in Caribbean music. So, with two minds ready to foster the show, it became time to write it. Ramirez and Ali were joined by a series of creative consultants that would help ease their jump with this material to the stage. This included composer David Yazbek and members from the original Buena Vista team, Nick Gold and the real Juan de Marcos Gonzalez. Like I mentioned, the music was essential. It's what the people knew, and as they were aware, it's basically flawless. And as Ali noted, and as anyone who has seen a jukebox musical knows, kindly and most lovingly, musical theater has a way of musical theatering any genre of music that it encounters. I'm looking at you, Aunt Juliet, an American idiot. You better stay quiet or you're next. So for maximum effect and authenticity, Buena Vista Social Club was going to do something that had never been done before. All of the songs were going to stay in Spanish. Everyone was incredibly aware that this was going to really increase the difficulty of selling the show to non-Spanish speaking audiences, but it was a challenge that they were willing to face. This would be faced by Marco Ramirez and a new addition to their creative team, husband and wife choreography team of two-time Tony winner Justin Peck and Patricia Delgado. The approach was simple. Use the book and the choreography to give all of the necessary context for the characters, setting, emotions, so that the songs themselves make sense by feeling rather than having to hear and understand every word. That way, the perfect music could remain uncompromised. So yeah, people who have issues with the Book of Buena Vista, there's a reason for it. So with a map to guide them as they created the show, the production barreled forward towards its opening at Atlantic Theater Company in New York in November 2023. But let's put a pin in that for now and talk about the origins of Real Women Have Curves. Real Women Have Curves came out at the American Repertory Theater in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The ART is one of those theaters that is really well known for being a testing ground for a lot of shows that are headed to Broadway. Like, think of a show like Waitress, Jagged Little Pill, Great Comet. All of these shows have had their first runs or pre-Broadway runs at the ART. And now, Real Women Have Curves is joining them. In contrast to Buena Vista, Real Women came about in a fairly similar way to many new musicals. In some ways, it's actually pretty similar to, like, Waitress. You have a show, at least in part, that's based on a movie that has a niche following, and you hire a talented pop songwriter, and then bing, bang, boom, you got something on your hand. And, like, respectfully, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So producer Jack Noseworthy and director choreographer Sergio Trujillo are here at the start. They wanted to begin with finding the right composer. They realize even though the story is set in the 80s, they need someone, ideally a Latina, who can really harness all of the nuances of this story. Because let's face it, it was going to be hard to be able to convey the ideas of Latinidad, womanhood, sisterhood, dreaming, among so many other themes in music. Enter Joy Huerta. Now, the Latine folks out there may have a pretty good idea of who she is, but I will do some explaining for those of you who don't. Joy Huerta is not someone of the musical theater community. She's a pop star, and a really big one at that. Hey, remember how I said just because you haven't heard of something, it doesn't mean that it's not huge? This is your second reminder. Joy is a Grammy and Latin Grammy winning Mexican singer and songwriter, and half of the duo Jesse and Joy with her older brother. Joy has noted that her influences in music come from a wide range of artists, including Aretha Franklin, Pedro Infante, and Carole King. And when you're looking for a composer, it's that influence, it's that wide range of interest that you're looking for as they hear characters in a different musical voice and get closer to that truth. So then adding to the writing team was playwright Lisa Loomer, who would flesh out how this version of Real Women Have Curves would differ from past versions and give Joy some characters and motivations to write for. Second, composer and lyricist Benjamin Velez joined as an added hand for Joy, so that she could gain an idea of the nuances of writing for the theater versus for a regular album. So with a writing team in hand, all they needed was some time to write. Luckily for them, they were all joining this project in the early months of 2020. Huerta and Velez got to work and spent a good amount of time learning how to identify with the characters while they were in lockdown. In their composition, they leaned on what they knew about the characters to give them the soundscape of the show. And that's one of the ways that Real Women Have Curves differentiates from Buena Vista. I remember hearing the cast album and I thought, this is the most diverse range of Latin music in a musical since In the Heights. And lo and behold, that was intentional by Joy and Benjamin. Joy and Benjamin took risks by attaching song styles to characters. That's how a character such as Carmen, who at one point in her life wanted to be a mariachi, demonstrates more of that mentality of the past and tradition. And so many of her songs incorporate those styles, like mariachi and cumbia. Whereas Ana, who dreams of doing more for the future, she's more contemporary. So a lot of her songs have a little bit more of that Latin pop sound. And these are just some of the styles that are present in this show. The women of the factory have a diverse background from several Latin American countries, so the show does its best to incorporate various styles rather than try to attach a singular sound to the moment or era. It's a story for all people, so they went with an inclusive sound. So there we have the baby inception of Real Women Have Curves as it moves towards its premiere at the ART in December of 2023.
The first time I felt represented on stage is kind of a multitude of an answer. I'm a multidiscipline artist, so I do theater, I do music, I do poetry. So music-wise, was seeing artists like Mark Anthony in concert. It was actually my first concert, or artists like Shakira, because I felt like I could see someone who looked like me on a world stage and someone that was very proud about their Latin identity. And when it comes to theater, I would have to say John Leguizamo's Ghetto Clown. The first time I saw his one-man show on TV, and it was like seeing parts of my identity, people in my family, people in my community, and really innately understanding what he was talking about. Or even artists like Caridad de la Luz, otherwise known as La Bruja, doing Puerto Rico, and she did theater and poetry at the same time.
Now that these shows are ready to open, let me tell you about their basic plots and what initially stuck out to audiences. The story of Buena Vista Social Club, like the documentary, is about the creation of the album, albeit a heavily fictionalized telling. Having done a good amount of research prior to seeing the show, I had spent most of the intermission explaining to my wife what elements of the story were and weren't true. That isn't to say that the show is at all undermined by not being historically accurate. I personally think the show might not be as resonant if it went with the strictly accurate route. The show lives in two worlds. First is the framing device of the show. It's the creation of the Buena Vista Social Club album in Cuba in the 90s. Music director Juan de Marcos Gonzalez is putting together a band of older Cuban musicians playing classics. Needing a special voice, he connects with singer Omara Portuondo, who is in his self-imposed retirement. The framing device sees the band's efforts to convince Omara to join the project. The rest of the show exists in Cuba in 1959, where a young Omara discovers the beauty of the real-life Buena Vista Social Club and forms a relationship with many of the musicians she would work with on the album years later, and faces the challenges that come with being an artist during a revolution. When it came to casting, two major aspects had to be considered among everything. First would be who would play Omara. The show would employ the age-old tactic of casting different performers for the primary roles in their old age versus their young age. Leading the group would be Broadway veteran Natalie Benicia Belcon from shows like Rent, Avenue Q, and Matilda. She masterfully brings an approach of an Omara who, despite having lived through so much, never forgets her qualifications and commands every room she enters, and it's incredible. Next most important would be the band. And when I say it took a long time, I mean it took like 2 years to put together a band. The original members of Buena Vista each were virtuoso talents in their respective instruments. That's part of the reason the album looms so large and why, till this point, the music wasn't very accessible in a live setting. What they found was a combination of musicians, some with experience playing on Broadway, others who were professional musicians, and others who had experience playing with some of the most influential Latin artists in history, including the original members of Buena Vista. Heading to the Atlantic Theater Company, the show was in great hands. Buena Vista Social Club opened in November 2023, and one thing was abundantly clear. Everyone was enamored. The show immediately became sold out night after night. It extended twice, and they had the reviews to back it up. The general consensus was the writers had did everything that they had intended to do. The music was the star. There was no issue with the music being in Spanish. The choreo was electric. The show looked amazing, but the book was just razor thin and nothing special. I will die on the hill that the book for Buena Vista is not as big a deal as everyone tries to make it out to be. Shortly after Buena Vista had its New York premiere, Real Women Have Curves was taking its first bow at the ART. The musical set in 1987 Boyle Heights, a predominantly Mexican neighborhood of Los Angeles. It tells the story of Ana, a Mexican-American girl who was the first in her family to be born in the United States. When her older sister's dress factory receives an order for 200 dresses in 2 weeks, Ana comes face to face with her dreams of studying writing at Columbia University, the experiences of becoming a young woman, her responsibilities to her family, and the realities faced by undocumented people living in the US. Audiences and critics really appreciated the way Real Women was able to handle everything it set out to do and called attention to the timeliness of the material. They respected the additions and subtractions from previous iterations of the show. Joy and Benjamin's score was praised for being able to toe the line with songs that were infectious tunes but still able to convey character, even if there was one too many songs about flying away. Reviews were really happy to say that the heavy material never made the audience feel afraid to have fun when they wanted to, and the women genuinely felt like a group of friends. Real Women made a point that 16 out of its 19 roles were being played by Latine performers. Featured in the cast was actress Justina Machado, who recently was notable for her role in One Day at a Time, but she's been all over the place and even has had some experience on the stage as well. The cast also featured Florencia Cuenca, who, when the show transferred to Broadway, would become the first woman born in Mexico to originate a role in a Broadway musical. And here we are, 2 shows running in the winter of 2023. They're both already loved by audiences and critics. And as if these shows weren't already somehow tied together, in September 2024, both shows announced that they would be opening on Broadway in the 2024-2025 season. Buena Vista would open at the Schoenfeld in February of 2025, and Real Women Have Curves would open at the James Earl Jones in April. So, barring a disaster, when Real Women Have Curves opened on Broadway, it would mark the first time that 2 musicals with Latine stories at the center would be running. For some shows, though, getting to Broadway is the easy part. But what comes after is where it gets a little tough.
The first time I felt represented on stage, this is a tough one because I don't think I actually had that experience until college, my freshman year, in a show that I was in. Even though I grew up in a predominantly BIPOC community, our theater department tended to do mostly Shakespeare or musicals for kids. So once I got to undergrad, I was glad to learn that my school had an annual cultural show called Carnaval that showcased Latinx culture and raised awareness about Latin American issues. Along with the skit, it had so many different dance acts that people could get involved in. Bachata, bomba, salsa, tango, and it offered a stage where we could express and embrace our identities through music and art and dance. It was where, for the first time, I saw a Latinx story. Stories about the impact of the World Cup in Brazil, about La Guerra Sucia in Argentina, and about anti-immigration political rhetoric and the climate prior to the 2016 election.
Let's chat a little bit more about these shows before they take their first bow on Broadway. Because, as I hope you're already able to see by now, these shows somehow do have more in common than meets the eye. And I mean that more in a content level as opposed to a production standpoint. which is funny if you think about it, because in the past, you almost had to be worried about shows from a particular community being too similar because it might have raised the red flags of stereotypes. But I think this is different, because on the one hand, Buena Vista is a dance piece, a jukebox show dedicated to showcasing technical excellence. It's about a specific country and people. And Real Women Have Curves is a conventional musical, as we know it, doing all of the right things to integrate music, story, and dance, and also doesn't limit itself to its musical identity. And as much as these aspects and so many others make these shows different from each other, and from so many other musicals, they do share one important quality: the level of respect that they give their respective subjects and themes, and recognizing the dignity and universal things that make people people. To demonstrate, let's just quickly look at how these shows address the theme of trauma versus a show like West Side Story. Listen, I know West Side Story is catching a lot of strays in this one. I promise I don't hate it. I love it in many places, but it's a really good example to use as a contrast. Think of some of the story elements that are present in these shows. Immigration, revolution, separating of families, living as a minority in the US, among others. There is a night and day difference between how trauma from all of this is explored in these shows versus so many works of the past. Now, of course, I can't rewrite West Side Story. Not that I actually think I'd want to, but like as it stands, the show at no point seeks to address any of the trauma that might inform the world that the sharks live in. Moving from Puerto Rico, having to learn how to assimilate to life in the US, etc. Every nugget of sympathy is so hidden within the show that you really got to work to get to like the fact that the Jets are canonically the ones who started beefing with the Sharks. Yet somehow they're the hero. I say this because even if there isn't time in the show, context and humanization go a long way in facilitating buy-in for a story that explores themes like trauma. By incorporating these crucial details, characters become more nuanced. A group like the Sharks doesn't choose violence because it's just the way that people like them are. It's because, like every person who's ever lived, they make their decisions based on lived experiences and those of the people around them. So in this case, Latinos aren't being traumatized for the sake of being traumatized. It returns to them the agency that we all have inherently as people. And to tie this back to Buena Vista and Real Women, call me crazy, but I think that the best way to address culturally specific trauma in an honest way that keeps the dignity of the person is to have someone from that culture involved in creating it. Who would have thought? I think the beautiful thing about these shows is that they're able to address the traumas their respective characters face as a reality to many Latine people, but they never lose sight that that's not who they are. These shows understand that something like trauma is what happens to us, and who we are is how we respond to those events. In Buena Vista, Omara is haunted by what the world has done to Cuba and how that affects the people, and how all of that has impacted her relationship with her sister. But she is still able to find the beauty and necessity in what she does as an artist, and uses what the world has done to her to stand up for the people around her. In Real Women, La Migra is an ever-looming threat. One minute the women are joking, being themselves, and the next they're hiding and listening to nothing but the sounds of a raid. Yet, when it's over, they're almost able to bounce back immediately. Ana is able to take all this in and harness it as fuel for her to change the world. These shows handle this with the honesty of, hey, look, this is happening, and as much as it scares me, as much as I feel it, I actively choose to continue to find some joy in life, not because I'm magically stronger or immune to it, but because I care more about creating something better for the future, for me, for my family, for my country, whoever. And because of it, I don't feel the hesitation of another story of Latine trauma, simply because the characters on stage have been given the time to genuinely think like humans who need to weigh personal feelings alongside the inherent expectations of their culture. It's the kind of thing you can't get from just any writer, and what makes these shows so wonderfully intertwined and necessary. Now, the season that these shows were entering in was fierce from all sides. For plays, you had a huge uptick in the amount of celebrities on stage, making those ticket prices go way up. You had must-see shows like Oh Mary, Purpose, and John Proctor as the villain, and that's just the plays. Putting it gently, 24-25 was a murderer's row for musicals. In Revival Land, you had Nicole Scherzinger and Sunset Boulevard, Audra McDonald and Gypsy, Jeremy Jordan and Floyd Collins. In the new shows, you could see Boop. You could see John Groff singing down Gracie Lawrence's throat. Idina Menzel have a deep personal connection with a tree. Megan Hilty and Jen Simard compete to literally blow the roof off of the Lunt Fontanne. And Darren Criss act with a plant that has the greatest voice in the American theater. In short, this was not a season where just any show could make it. If you wanted to survive, you had to be excellent, and even more so, lucky. Buena Vista Social Club would be the first to make it to Broadway, along with its new producers, including John Leguizamo, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and his father, Luis. As with many shows that take the leap to Broadway, some changes did take place. The show remained pretty much intact, and most of the changes came from casting. But I mean, you worked this long for a very specific product, you're not going to change it that much. The show moved to the Schoenfeld and was able to utilize the leap in space to make everything bigger and fuller. This meant an increased work for the sound team, a bigger playing space for the actors, which meant that Justin Peck and Patricia Delgado had room to expand their choreography and make it even more grand. It began previews on February 21st, 2025, and opened on March 19th. And just like with its run at the Atlantic, Buena Vista was a darling with critics and audiences alike. Variety called it the most intoxicating show of the season and even called it a gentler Follies, which I think is a very funny way to describe a show's quality while making sure that they know not to be worried about being depressed at the end. Elizabeth Vincentelli of the New York Times echoed what had come before. She noted the thrill of having the music as the star, the fact that the adjustments the show had made since the Atlantic really made the whole show soar. The show respects the intelligence of the audience and doesn't try to be anything other than a piece of art. But the book still needed some work. Friends, seriously, it's not that deep. The music is the star, and the book is doing what's necessary to get you there. It just doesn't bother me when it's this good. Natalie Venetia Belcon continued to be mesmerizing to everyone. The band was awe-inspiring. The show was praised for its nuance and the depiction of Afro-Latinos. And the box office reflected this, with attendance and grosses nearly doubling within the first week of previews alone. The show was already on its way to being a sellout on Broadway too. Almost immediately, it became clear that Buena Vista would be one of the top contenders for Best Musical come Tony season. Then, it was Real Women Have Curves' turn. The shift to Broadway signaled more work for Real Women than it had been for Buena Vista. Most notably was the cutting of songs from the ART production, and Joy Huerta and Benjamin Velez got back to work and wrote a few new songs for Broadway. Additionally, casting was underway for a new lead, with Tatiana Córdoba making her Broadway debut as Ana. Tatiana would be joining Justina and Florencia, who, as I mentioned earlier, would in fact break ground as the first Mexican woman to ever originate a role in a Broadway musical. Real Women started previews on April 1st and opened on April 27th at the James Earl Jones Theater, being one of those shows that really just sneaks in to the end of the season before eligibility cuts off for the Tonys. Laura Collins Hughes from the New York Times gave the show a fairly positive review. For Florencia Cuenca, it was a huge accomplishment for her, but also a proud moment for her as a mom, genuinely feeling that her role of Estela held a piece of herself in it. She was able to be seen on stage. In my research, I've come across interview after interview of Florencia saying how inspiring it was for her personally to be her authentic self in the role. And immediately, it became clear that Real Women was building a passionate community. I remember when the show opened, all I saw online was creators, Latine and others, all uniformly agreeing that this show had heart. It was special, and it was a dark horse contender for Best Musical. It was the kind of show that the world needed right now. And so here we are. 2 shows centered around Latine stories running on Broadway at the same time.
Having not just one, but 2 Latino-centered Broadway productions running at the same time is groundbreaking. It's not just a reminder of the rich tapestry of Latino culture, of the lived experience of immigrants in this country and the experience of emigration for those who stayed and worked in Cuba, but that our stories as a whole deserve to be told. That Latinos deserve to be centered and celebrated in the media that is consumed by the masses. These stories aren't just being told by us for us. They are loud and proud celebrations of Latino culture and Latinidad being unapologetically presented to audiences that are not predominantly Latino. Evie Luciano.
This was a moment to celebrate, but as quickly as this came together, things were about to change because we were headed for Tony season.
I have always thought representation mattered, and I still think that. But it's especially important in the arts and entertainment, specifically in theater, because it gives people of any marginalized identity the confirmation that they do matter and that their stories do deserve to be told. And it gives somebody so much confidence, to say, I can do that too, because here's somebody of my identity or similar to me, and they're out there and they're excelling at whatever it is that they're doing. And it's, simply said, it's inspiring. Representation inspires. I think a lot of us have, that one memory that we think of when we saw somebody like us doing something incredible and we thought, oh my gosh, that's me, or oh my gosh, I can do it too. Everyone has that memory, and it's locked into your brain for a reason. So representation is such a powerful thing for somebody, even in the simplest way.
So I'm aware that a lot of people know how important Tony wins and nominations are, but this situation can really give some insight into how important the value that kind of publicity can have. Because even in the most successful Broadway season ever, ticket sales are not equally distributed. Yep, we're looking at grosses. The musical Kimberly Akimbo, which, if you don't know, won the Tony for Best Musical in 2023, reported sales of around $400,000 a week before that year's Tony nominations. 2 weeks after it went home with 5 Tonys, the show saw a jump to $700,000 a week. That was a new high for that show, and that little show was able to ride that notoriety all the way till April of the following year. Of course, this can be a bit of an oversimplification, but I think you can see how this can translate. Now, I'm not saying Buena Vista Social Club didn't need to worry about nominations, because everything helps, but these two shows were in a very different place financially heading into nominations. Buena Vista, which did have a couple months to build momentum, was already pulling in just over $1 million a week by the time the Tony nominations came out. Real Women Have Curves, which mind you had only started previews a month before, was barely pulling in $300,000, a number that any show, regardless of quality, doesn't want to be near, as theater owners are always looking for any reason to pull the plug on a show. This is where the awards show narratives kind of split. As the Tonys approached, Buena Vista Social Club was looking to make the case as to why it was the best show of the season. Real Women Have Curves was looking for any semblance of life to keep the show open. May 1st. The day of Tony nominations had arrived, and both shows looked on wondering how the next few minutes would impact the next months of their lives. And it quickly became clear what was happening. Of the 13 possible categories available for new musicals, Buena Vista Social Club ended up in 10 of them, including a nomination for Best Musical. The nominations had to have felt repetitive after a while, as Maybe Happy Ending and Death Becomes Her walked away with 10 nominations also. And Buena Vista seemed to be in a great spot to make some real noise on June 8th. Many of its nominations came in the categories that the show specifically focused on. Add in the fact that the show was already going to have a guaranteed Tony when it was announced that the band of Buena Vista, a group that doesn't have its own competitive category, would be honored with a special Tony just for being so freaking awesome. If there's ever been a more appropriate reason to give a special Tony, I don't know what it is. The magic these guys do in front of an audience every day is the reason why awards exist in the first place. But Buena Vista had what it needed. It had the clout to look at voters and audiences and say with confidence that this show is a great time, it is a pleasure to look at, and the experience is a piece of art. But the nominations weren't so kind to Real Women Have Curves. In a competitive year, especially for musicals, fans of the show hoped that the show would snag a Best Musical nomination or even find some luck in the technical categories. The people who'd seen the show at this point knew that the show was too special to go unnoticed. Unfortunately, in a year where several shows got multiple nominations and the competition among actresses being steep, the field just became too crowded. And Real Women Have Curves walked away with 2 nominations, one for Justina Machado for Best Featured Actress in a Musical, and one for Joy Huerta and Benjamin Velez for Best Original Score. Watching this all go down in real time, I truly can't forget how, despite the odds not looking great for Real Women Have Curves, its community never gave up on it. Everyone knew that it was a show that everyone needed to see, and nominations or not, they were going to campaign hard. In the weeks leading up to the Tonys, both shows did their thing. They made their appearances on morning shows. They both released their cast albums on June 6th. Seriously, these shows somehow did so much together, yet it felt like they rarely ever were interacting with each other. Real Women Have Curves was even able to secure a performance slot on the Tonys. June 8th. At the Tonys, Buena Vista took home 4 awards in addition to its special award for the band, giving it a total of 5. And these awards solidified what the show had to offer to audiences moving forward. It won Best Featured Actress in a Musical for Natalie Venetia Belgon's performance, Best Choreography for Justin Peck and Patricia Delgado, Best Orchestrations for Marco Bagua, Best Sound Design for Jonathan Deans. Meanwhile, Real Women Have Curves' night mostly ended relatively early, with Justina losing to Natalie and Joy and Benjamin losing Best Score to Maybe Happy Ending. What was exciting was that Real Women did have a chance to show off just a piece of what everyone loves so much with their performance. I recall not being alone, seeing online how many casual viewers were getting excited, finally getting to see some of what the excitement was all about, as it was genuinely one of the best performances of the night. Overall, the Tonys were symbolic of the value of representation. Each and every performer and artist involved in these shows has the talent to be given all of the praise in the world, and this showed that the platform was the only thing that was needed. Speaking as a viewer of the Tonys, I watched that performance and was even more dead set on wanting to spend my money on that ticket for both of these shows, as long as they both could make it to the end of the summer. June 17th. The floor had at last dropped out. On June 17th, a flood of articles came in and passed along the news that many had already feared was imminent. Real Women Have Curves was going to be closing on June 29th. If we're looking at it strictly from an X's and O's standpoint, it's very clear as to why the closing notice came. Real Women Have Curves was unfortunately the victim of the business of Broadway. Like I mentioned before the nominations, the show was not in a good place financially. The love the show received and the praise of its content just never turned to ticket sales. And at its best, the show never made enough to cover its cost, and unfortunately, in an environment that doesn't allow for shows to take time, for the producers, it was time to make the call. But there was no way that the show would take its closing notice quietly. If Real Women Have Curves had 2 weeks left, the people were going to show up the best they could to make their voices heard, to give the show a fighting chance. Every show has a fan base that will go to war for it. Like, think about if a show like The Outsiders or Hadestown were not in the spot of success they had achieved after years on Broadway. They have notoriously vocal and passionate fans that, not to be too hyperbolic, would move heaven and earth if something were ever to happen to their shows. I mean, the Beetlejuice fandom was so strong that they managed to get the show brought back to Broadway twice in 4 years. So it stands to reason that if everyone who loved the show advocated as loud as they could, support the show with their money, and get others to do the same, maybe there was a chance. TikTok became a flood of #SaveCurves and people upon people pouring their hearts out into why the show matters now. The cast of Real Women became familiar faces on the For You page. People upon people were speaking about how the message of the show resonated with the times we live in, how it was so important for finding a moment for people to share and connect with each other. I can really only describe it as a moment of true intersectionality. Like, yeah, Latine people made a big number of the advocates, but what was really inspiring was that understanding that by supporting Real Women Have Curves, non-Latine folks were able to understand how this show opens the door for more representation for all. The audience came, and as Tatiana Cordova would reflect on later, just not soon enough. They knew what they had, but it just wasn't there. The show saw a huge spike in ticket sales, which eventually saw it smash its previous high in grosses, but Real Women Have Curves still closed on June 29th, after 31 previews and 73 performances. The closing raised some questions for some on how shows like Buena Vista Social Club is able to sustain and continue, while Real Women Have Curves just couldn't do the same. I'll quickly touch on this, but that's not what this episode is about. This episode is not about why one and why not the other. It's about celebrating them both. The world already does enough to pit people of the global majority against each other. You ain't going to find it here. For some, Buena Vista had an established brand, as it was a huge deal when it came out in the late 90s, and through it was able to bring a bigger audience, while Real Women Have Curves had some brand recognition, but not enough. Some believe Real Women Have Curves didn't do enough in its marketing to best represent the show or get it to the right audiences. There is a great debate to be had on whether a show like this should be marketed specifically for a Latine audience or use the old, it's a show for everybody routine. Even members of the cast believe that this played more than a significant part. Some think Real Women was just the victim of timing in one of the most stacked Broadway seasons in recent history, not only for musicals but for plays that were all fighting for the same audience. Or the reasons that annoy me, like the rumor that some audiences might just assume that Buena Vista and Real Women were about Latine people, so their content would be roughly about the same, so there was no need to see them both. And the one that makes me roll my eyes harder than anything, the Latine audience just didn't care to show up. It's time for me to have an impassioned rant here on this one. The median income of a Broadway theater goer is around $276,000, people. We cannot blame the customer when the product is historically out of reach. Can't blame the content if there isn't a chance for someone to even enter the door. I saw Buena Vista, and judging from the amount of people doing all the stuff I see Latinos doing at every single party and concert and gathering, namely filming and dancing, best believe if there was any way for the average person to see both shows in a safe financial way, trust they would have been there. It doesn't mean you hate Broadway to say that accessibility and knowing how to market to different cultural audiences is a skill the industry needs to work on. Half the battle is knowing how to say you need to improve, and the other half is doing it. Anyway, the truth about why Real Women closed is somewhere in the middle of all of these things, but at the end of the day, on Broadway, it's show business. If any show, for any reason, isn't making the cut, the people in charge are gonna let it go. And the impact of the show was present regardless, both by the people who got to see it as well as those who were able to participate from a distance.
I think it's important for any artist, regardless of background, to see themselves represented, because particularly for artists of color, artists with disabilities, queer artists, it is not often our stories are told, and our stories, when shared, are often relatable to so many people, even if we don't realize it at first. I remember taking my mom to see American Mariachi at the Cleveland Playhouse, and we both had never seen any sort of mariachi on a theater stage. But the story of a daughter of immigrants struggling with supporting her parents through mental health concerns, very relatable. And of course, the mariachi music added a beautiful context and spin to it that made it all the more meaningful to us. And so I think it's important to see shows outside of our identity because it really helps us learn that we all share very similar parallels in our stories and our lives, and that's how we find commonality and community when we need it the most.
I brought up a lot of opinions, but what I really wanted this episode to be about is the fact that representation like this, regardless of a show's financial or critical success, no matter the endless amount of criteria we use to judge a regular musical, these shows, by existing, have given something to the Latine community simply by having their moment. So before I fully steer into the closing of this episode, I want to share with you some of the thoughts from Latine folks on what these shows have meant to them.
These works could not have arrived at a better time. They offer powerful visual celebrations of the richness and diversity of Latinx art and culture in this country. They are redefining inclusive storytelling and revealing the power of art to reflect and reshape our communities. To Hollywood, they serve as a call to action, spotlighting the classic stories and new narratives still waiting to be invested in, produced, and serialized. And to everyone else, they offer a reality check. Aquí estamos, and this too is our home. Arlene Davila.
Leonardo Reina, who plays the piano in Buena Vista, says there's a lot of generations in this cast that have been through this artistic process. It's a healing process for our community. There is a strong power that we have found through music to express our most deep feelings and dreams for the well-being and the success of our histories, our stories.
In fact, only 8% of Broadway audiences are Latino, according to a 2023 study by the Broadway League. At a time when our contributions to this country are actively being attacked and erased, our stories are being told on Broadway stages to a global audience. Our creative talents are actively taking up space in a medium that is not traditionally dominated by Latino talent. Even as some seek to villainize us and politicize our very existence, we are here. We exist. Our stories matter. Our talents matter. We matter. And these joyous and proud celebrations of Latino culture are allowing us to not just be seen by ourselves, but by the world. Evie Luciano.
What I think is really beautiful is that in my heart of hearts, I know that even though these two shows weren't able to occupy Broadway together for very long, I think it still is more than enough time to lay down a new layer for the house. At the time of writing this, Buena Vista Social Club is still a bona fide hit and selling incredibly well, and has yet to show any signs of slowing down. Meaning audiences are actively choosing to do what we consistently beg them to do and put their dollars behind the tickets. The show is evidence that yes, the music and art of Latin America and so many other countries can be included in the same oeuvre as Mozart and Bach and Rachmaninoff, and it can serve as the definitive evidence that you, contrary to what some people might have you think, can absolutely create resonant artistic experiences in a language other than English. That your art can be used to change the lives of the people around you. It's a lesson in empathy. And yeah, Real Women Have Curves' time on Broadway was disappointingly short. But maybe it's because it's meant to be a show whose impact is most felt when its time on Broadway is over. Because let's be honest, most Broadway shows, your favorites, even some of the most popular shows of all time, don't last long. Some don't make it to Broadway at all. Yet we're still able to see their incredible value because they're available to people in the long run. So while I don't think it's fair that Real Women had such a short run, its lessons of remaining ambitious in the face of uncertainty and believing in the strength of those that came before and paying it forward will never go away. I do hold on to a sliver of optimism that hopefully one day Real Women Have Curves becomes a staple of regional and community theaters, so that its message continues to grow and thrive for audiences as well as the community, and hopefully be one of those shows that inspires a whole new crop of Latine performers. Like, think about that. Think, like, even my non-Latine folks, think back to a moment in the theater where you truly fell in love with the art. It could be the first time you heard the last note of Defying Gravity or the whole ensemble singing One Day More. You know what that moment is for you. Every single one of you has that moment. And now, thanks to Buena Vista Social Club and Real Women Have Curves, an untold amount of Latine folks will have a moment like that for themselves. And when I think about how many artists who will be able to look at the stage and say, I want to be just like them, I'm re-inspired alongside them. Because every little step acts as a ripple effect. Every new addition to this community reaffirms that art belongs to everyone, and that everyone, regardless of where they come from, should feel embraced to use their creative voice. And that's the beautiful thing about actually having variety. You can weigh what a show puts emphasis on, what its best qualities are, and you can decide for yourself whether the show is right for you, based on your own criteria, not the limits of what has come before historically. And even better is the idea of having a repertoire or a canon of our own to pick from, and even better, it will signal that there is always more stories and opportunities ahead. Art, just like the world around us, is at its best when we can feel and value and respect the presence of people not like ourselves. Here in 2025, we are at a specific moment where the powers that be, now more than ever, are trying to silence the voices of Latino people throughout the country and tell the world that making space for the voices of others is dangerous. They want to force people out, turn them into the enemy, and scare them into downplaying who they are, where they come from, and to surrender every beautiful thing about their culture. Having a show like Buena Vista and Real Women, and continuing to spread the messages of these shows and the work of Latine voices, is their own form of resistance. And by using them, we prepare the next generation who will continue that work. We always talk about how familia and comunidad are so present in Latine stories. Giving spotlight on these shows on stage, in conversation, is how we encourage and uplift our community by telling them you can be a triple threat like Tatiana Córdoba. You can be a virtuoso like Redecito Avich. You can come from anywhere like Florencia Cuenca. Our music matters. You don't have to give up your language to fit in. Our presence matters. Who you are does not have to dictate what you're allowed to dream about. Who you are is enough to move mountains. And frankly, I can't wait to see what we do next. And that's the end of this episode. Before I get out of here, I want to give a special thanks to everyone who lent me a hand, whether through audio or supplying resources, or just a great conversation. Mark Eugene Garcia, Cedric Leiva, Alejandro Martinez, Bridget Martinez, Lionel Morales, Raja Morales, Camila Pinheiro, and Emery Satilli. For more information on this episode's topic, I highly recommend you listen to both Buena Vista Social Club and Real Women Have Curves' cast recordings. I also encourage you to read Josefina López's original play, Real Women Have Curves, watch the 2002 film, as well as listen to the original Buena Vista Social Club album and the documentary of the same name. Additionally, if it's possible, I highly recommend you see Buena Vista Social Club on Broadway. It really is as good as it's been made out to be. I also want to acknowledge these resources, representation, cultural representations, and signifying practices. Jose Can You See, Latinos on and off Broadway by Alberto Sandoval Sanchez. Latin Looks, Images of Latinos and Latinos in New Media by Carla E. Rodriguez. Cuba and Its Music by Ned Sublet, among others. Lastly, I want to thank all of you who are listening. I restarted writing this episode several times because I could not find the right approach, which means the episode didn't come out as quickly as I would have liked to, but I appreciate you being here now. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pocket Dramaturg. This episode was hosted, written, edited, and produced by Ricky Ortega, associate producer and additional voiceover work by Bridget Martinez. You can follow the show on Instagram at pocket_dramaturg, TikTok and Blue Sky at Pocket Dramaturg, and you can subscribe to the show on YouTube as well. Last, if you enjoyed the show, leave a comment and share with someone you know. See y'all next time.